The fallout of the May 2011 Abbottabad raid for Pakistan was critical. Allegations of harboring the world's most wanted man were leveled against the ISI and the military leadership, which flatly denied any knowledge of the inhabitants of the by now infamous compound. The Karzai government felt vindicated that its allegation of Pakistan's primary role in the creation and operation of anti-government insurgency in Afghanistan appeared to be borne out, as the alleged architect of 9/11 was found to have been hiding out under the shadow of Pakistan's military academy. Pakistan fell under immense pressure politically, while domestically the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan was tying down the military in a costly attrition in the Waziristans. In Afghanistan, the Taliban pushed their insurgency to Kabul with the assassination of Hamid Karzai's brother and also of Burhanuddin Rabbani, who had been mediating talks between the government and the Taliban leadership. Sensing this pressure and attributing it to Pakistan, Karzai formally signed a strategic and security partnership with India in October 2011, a move that Pakistan perceived as a worst-case strategic scenario. This was followed in November by the conclusion of a 10-year security agreement between Karzai and the United States, enabling US forces to remain in country effectively indefinitely. The agreement proved very unpopular, particularly among rural Pashtuns, but also in cities across the north, inspiring the Taliban to unleash a massive spring offensive in early 2012, with a high-profile attack on Kabul's extremely heavily securitized diplomatic quarter. As the Taliban appeared to be gaining momentum, a sequence of deadly errors by US personnel had the effect of distancing ISAF partners. A series of burnings of the Quran and worse treatment of it by US personnel in Baghram ignited sensibilities across the country, as did a killing spree of civilians by a US sergeant in Kandahar. France's newly elected President Hollande announced that French troops would be exiting the ISAF campaign that year, a year ahead of standing commitments. In another setback, the US was forced to cease recruitment of Afghans for the security forces after a number of high-profile attacks on US personnel by individuals in Afghan uniforms. By the following spring, the US campaign in the country was in dire straits. The surge had ended over a year ago, with no appreciable effect on the insurgency. Opium cultivation was at an all-time high. NATO's ISAF was concluding its operations, and partner countries were preparing to leave what was a losing war in front of an enemy that appeared to be gaining ground and winning people's sentiments and support daily. Faced with the prospect of a continuous and unpopular war, the Obama administration announced that it intended to engage in direct talks with the Taliban in 2013, prompting Hamid Karzai to temporarily suspend cooperation with the US. The Taliban opened up an office in Dubai for this purpose, but continued to pursue the insurgency across the country and in Kabul, with the high-profile killing of the IMF country representative in Kabul. The US had realized that the insurgency could not be uprooted or quashed, the reason being that the Taliban were not actually controlling the insurgency. In fact, there were multiple insurgencies across the country. Most were extremely local, with individuals or familial groupings seeking to protect their homes, land, and farming from foreign troops whom they perceived as bringing war with them. The insurgency no longer had an exclusively rural Pashtun character to it. By 2015, it was an amalgamation of insurgencies against foreign troops, against the encroachment of a notoriously inefficient government that was largely seen as operating as a narco-state, and an expression of Islamic sensibilities that had been perceived to have been offended by the state and its foreign partners. Ironically, it was the US that needed the Taliban Leadership Council so as to have an interlocutor to negotiate a settlement with. How effective that leadership was in controlling the insurgency was of secondary importance. The main point was that it should have legitimacy among the rural Khilji. This is why the Taliban stated attacks would continue during any negotiations. It had no choice, as it couldn't stop them anyway, since there were so many localized insurgencies unfolding, each according to its own local dynamics. Afghanistan had become a headless matrix of insurgency, with no unifying method or purpose except the removal of all foreign troops. Thus, the Taliban needed to maintain that outcome as its primary purpose, so as to function as the general leadership of that objective. By the close of the Obama presidency, it was oppressively clear that the US needed to extricate itself from Afghanistan, but the Afghan government, to which the US had been so committed, was still far too ineffective and corrupt to generate the public support needed to withstand a Taliban-led onslaught if the US military had pulled out. The Taliban, on the other hand, were not yet strong enough to deliver the popular sentiment of the insurgency to a national unity government. The following year, in early 2016, the US brought back the former symbol of Khilji Pakhtun political aspirations and claimant to the presidency of Afghanistan, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, out of exile in Iran under an immunity guarantee by the new government of Abdul Ghani. Hekmatyar was pardoned, had all UN sanctions against him dropped, and received an honorary governmental role. He then appealed to the Taliban to lay down arms and enter into negotiations for a unity government. But the appeal had little impact, as insurgency intensified in Kabul, in Kunduz, and across Badakhshan, the Tajik heartland. As the Trump administration announced a renewed effort to negotiate a settlement, the Ghani government was effectively under siege in the capital, not unlike Najibullah had been 20 years prior. But crucially, the opposition to the Ghani government was far more divided than the surging Taliban that Najibullah had faced. The Taliban now appeared to be biding their time and seeking to convert the momentum of the insurgency into a political force that could impose its core requirements upon a final settlement, namely the comprehensive withdrawal of all foreign forces and a share in the Wolesi and Loya Jirgas, reflecting the claim to represent the majority of the population. The Taliban maintained that it would not talk to the Ghani government. Rather, it could speak directly to the US, which could then impose any agreement upon its client government in Kabul. It appeared that the US was willing to concede a significant drawdown of troops and confine them to bases, but the makeup of the legislature could not be reconfigured as per the Taliban's demands. As the negotiations stalled, and some insurgents began to view the Taliban as selling out the cause of removing all foreign forces in exchange for Jirga seats, a new threat emerged in key areas where the Taliban had claimed to have held popular support. ISIS of Khorasan appeared and declared its aim of launching a global caliphate starting from Afghanistan. I'm your host, Dr. Omar Khan. Thank you for joining me on Insight.